This episode's not really about pens so much as it's about what you do with pens. And the other thing this episode is about is a breakthrough I had in my desire to journal. Now, I am going to talk at length about what that means, but I want to tell you a little bit about how my brain works, what's going on when it's not dealing with fountain pens, and a little bit about me so you have some context. And then I want to talk to you about this breakthrough I had where all of a sudden it all made perfect sense. So let's get to that right now. I'm Joshua Lax, fountain pen user, collector, a bit like Ollivanders, right? And all-around fanatic. In fact, I'm so obsessed, I started a business where I get to work with other people's pens. But now I want to show you everything I love about the world of fountain pens. From the new pens, to the old pens, the nibs, the ink, the paper, and especially the people. This is Uncapped. When I say journal, I mean the act of writing to yourself, for the purpose of satisfying yourself. So a writing activity that's inward, that is what I'm talking about. And the issue I've always had with this is I could never figure out how to get started. And I always felt like my problem was that I couldn't stop pressuring myself and doing it the right way or making it the most it could be. Anyway, I had put an undue burden on myself to do something different than I normally do. And I was conceived of writing in a journal, being a journaler, etc., as something that I really just couldn't get into. And I think part of it was because I just didn't understand that when you pursue the act of journaling, you have to actually do it in a way that makes sense for you. So over the past year, I've had a couple different exchanges with people about prompts, different ways to get into journaling, and all of them constantly had the same problem, which was I would have to have a dialogue, at least this is how I perceived it, I would have to have a dialogue with the paper and myself. So it would be me writing to myself, essentially, is what I felt like. And for one reason or another, either psychosis or fear or just not knowing what to say to myself, I could never bring myself to do it. Now, that is kind of funny in a way because I often have lots of thoughts. My brain is going constantly from the moment I get up in the morning into brushing my teeth, on the Peloton, on the way to drop the kids off, wherever I am. Even when people are talking to me, I'm sometimes thinking, and I apologize for that, but I'm constantly thinking and I'm constantly analyzing and I'm actually talking to myself constantly. I feel like my whole life, the inward part of my life, is a running dialogue with myself. And not that I have voices in my head, I don't want anyone to think that. But I just feel like my thoughts just are consistently a dialogue internally where I'm analyzing and processing the world. So for me to then say, okay, well, I'm going to do something different where I'm going to commit that to paper, I just could never bring myself to do it. At the same time, I do actually write a lot, and I do things that I think some people do as part of their journaling practice. So, for example, in my work as a lawyer, I have to make notes, right? There's another thing that I do for my work as a trial attorney, which is to write arguments. And when you write an argument, it's usually either contained in a letter or this thing called a brief, which has like a very specific format that gets followed. You don't need to know all that. But you're doing two things in that. One is you're telling the person the aspects of the story. And I say person, I mean the judge. So we'll go with the judge. You're telling the judge aspects of the story that are important. You're telling them what law is important. And then you're telling them why the law, as it relates to the facts you say are important, means they should decide the issue in a certain way, right? So that is an argument, persuasiveness, whatever you want to call it. But what that process entails is you are, in the written word, talking to somebody, right? It is being written in a way that it's addressed to an individual, not yourself. When you do a trial, you do something similar, but different, right? You're not really talking to the jury about what the law is in a particular place, or what the laws say, or what the cases say, or what other judges have thought. You're not getting into any of that. But what you're doing is you're basically starting off talking to the jurors. And you're starting off talking to the jurors either when you're picking the jury and the judge or the place you're trying the case lets you actually talk to the jury, or you are going to talk to the jury for the first time in what's called an opening statement. So if you think on TV or in movies, right, there's a point in the trial where it begins where the lawyers each get up and tell the jury what the case is about. In fact, if you want a great example of it, I recommend the movie Philadelphia with Denzel Washington. I have taught in law schools lawyering skills, and we used the Denzel Washington opening statement from that trial as an example. That is just an aside if you want further clarity on everything I'm talking about. Nonetheless, getting back to what we were focused on. So when you're doing that activity, right, again, you're thinking about it from the perspective of talking to someone else. And when you're doing that, you're telling them a story. And for that particular activity, when you tell them the story, you are telling it to them in a way you want them to accept it and digest it, right? So you're interweaving sort of like an emotional pitch. You're interweaving the things that people use, like common sense, and you want to clue them into that, right? So it's a more encompassing project, but nonetheless, the bottom line is that when I do it, and I've done it 30-something times now, you're talking to people about some situation in some other place, and you're telling them a story, and you're telling them what's important about that story, and they're telling them about what your client went through, and why, at the end of the case, they're going to hear all the evidence, and they're going to decide the case in your favor. There's another thing called a summation or a closing. Usually you see those in movies because those tend to be the most jazzy or dramatic, where, the lawyers get up at the end of the trial and make this big grandiose speech usually. Often in movies it's portrayed a little differently because they get into all sorts of things that you could never get into in court. Again, I'm getting a little bit down the rabbit hole, I apologize. But in those circumstances, you're again talking to somebody, and I've done that as well. So my life is kind of interesting, and I guess from the career perspective, is that I do a lot of writing, but it's like this very focused, narrow, specific types of writing that the general population doesn't really subscribe to, although they're somewhat familiar with it from pop culture, books, the media, what have you. So that is the writing life of Joshua J. Lax. That's, by the way, what I use in my legal moniker. So let's get back to journaling, and how does this all relate to journaling? So I, at this point now, because I've been a lawyer for roughly the same amount of time, 15 years, I'm very comfortable with the act of talking to people or writing in a way that addresses someone else about some other situation. Now, of course, in all of these situations, what makes a lawyer able to do their job is that the things they're writing about do not directly involve them. However, I'm obviously here on YouTube, so I have some degree of comfort with talking about myself and some of the things that I experience. So the idea of opening up to someone about myself isn't really the challenge. It was just this idea that I would have to address myself through an inner monologue that's already happening. So what does any of that have to do with this conundrum I started with, the idea that I can't or couldn't or wouldn't journal? Well, about 2 weeks ago, Atlas Stationers had its sidewalk sale. And during the course of that sidewalk sale, they had live streams of panels on YouTube that they were hosting, I guess, alongside or during the course of their sidewalk sale, which is like a mini pen show from what I can gather. And during the course of it, they had a live stream of a panel that I watched, and the topic of too many blank journals or having a journal acquisition problem whereby you acquire journals and notebooks and you never write in them came up. And, obviously I've already confessed to you that I am super guilty of that, and I've been trying to overcome that problem. So my ears perked up when they started talking about it. And in the course of that discussion, one of the panelists quoted Ernest Hemingway in A Movable Feast. And the line that they quoted was something like, "Write the truest sentence you know." And the speaker proposed that was a good way to kickstart yourself writing in a journal. That if you had a blank page and you're staring at it in front of you and you don't know what to write, just write the truest sentence you know and go from there. Now, I did not immediately just go pick up a journal and write the truest sentence I know. I reflected on it first. And I will tell you, I don't think I ever wrote the truest sentence I know. Well, actually, that's not true. Let's not get distracted with that right now. I did not immediately go grab a journal and write the truest sentence I know. But I started to think about that idea of what would I write if I had to write the truest sentence I know, which I know kind of defeats the point of the journaling, but I don't mean it that I was like imagining journaling. I mean it more of like, it caused me to think about how I would actually set that up. And again, I said to myself, I'm not writing myself the truest sentence I know. Like, that seems silly. I know the truest sentence I know. I'm talking to myself internally constantly. I don't need to do that. And then it hit me. The light bulb went off. And I said to myself, but I could write the truest sentence I know that I'd want someone else to hear. And in that moment, dear viewers, I sort of had an epiphany or a catharsis, or maybe those are the same thing. In any event, the glass shattered and I suddenly realized the problem that I was struggling with for all these years was not that I was in some way unable to journal. It's that I would rather journal as if I'm talking to another person, much in the way I'm very comfortable putting a camera in front of my face and talking to all of you. And so the breakthrough that came was, you don't need to journal in a dialogue with yourself. You could write a journal in a way where you're addressing it to other people. And it's totally fine if nobody ever reads it, because you're not doing it necessarily to communicate this information. You just need to do it in a way that works for you. And so that was the breakthrough. The breakthrough was, I can journal, but I don't need to address it or have a dialogue with myself. I can basically write it in the way I would write lots of things that I write and am very comfortable writing. And that is to write it in a way that it is addressed to the proverbial all of you, meaning whoever I would, show it to, for example. So that is the catharsis. That was the glass shattering moment. 2 weeks ago, I picked up on page 39 out of however many, and I don't write every day, but every couple of days I do a little writing session, and I'm now up to 85 in the lectern notebook. The other thing I want to tell you about this episode is how I shot it compared to the other ones. So it's now about 5 o'clock. I sat down here at 4:09 p.m. and I set up the camera, plugged in everything, got the lights going, and just started rolling. And I basically talked in 10 to 15 minute increments, so my throat is starting to get a little dry. So I apologize if some bizarre sound comes out of me. But essentially what I did was film this like I would imagine many of you, and I know myself, journal, which is just you start and you write, and maybe you pause, and maybe you go back, maybe you rewrite something, maybe you make some notes in the margin. Whatever you do, you're not doing it in such a formulaic or structured way. It's a little more free-flowing. And so for the episode where I talk about journaling and myself, I actually wanted to see what it would be like to film this as if it was a journaling activity, meaning I did not make any sort of plan. I had ideas of what I wanted to say, the ideas of what I wanted to communicate, but I just sort of started filming in 10 to 15 minute increments, and then later I'll go back and edit it down to a much more digestible amount of time. So I'm hoping it comes out. We'll see how it goes. But I wanted to let you know that this was a little more experimental than they usually are. Because usually what I do is I have a plan. I have a discrete topic, right? It's Leonardo fountain pen nibs. So there's some sort of intro before the kind of standard introduction. Then there's me talking to the camera. Then there's me giving you an introduction, looking at the particular pen or pens or nibs, whatever it is. Then we get into kind of in a series of chapters, kind of the subtopics I want to address. For this, I did not want to do that. I literally sat down and just wanted to speak to the camera and see what happens. Because just like I was talking about with the journal, I wanted to know what if I just went from sentence to sentence that I know to be true and just talked about it and saw later what the result is. So I now probably have about 50 minutes of footage. So at the point that you're hearing me say 50 minutes, I hope that you've only been watching this for really 10 to 15 minutes. That at this moment is my goal that I'm expressing to you. And I hope that 10 to 15 minutes was extremely compelling, moving, made you reflect. And, one of the great things about this community is we all share with each other our experience with these individual objects. And so for me, doing a video like this and being able to share with the community my experience with these individual objects has been very satisfying. And I want to thank you all for spending the time with me today.